Welcome back to another episode of Perligo Ponders, in which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories about my own comments, questions, and theories related to the lore and music of 21 Pilots. As always, if you would like your own comment to be featured in the next episode, just comment something interesting down below, a question you have, a theory you would like to propose, or just a general comment. Feel free to flag it as Perligo Ponders if you'd like, but I don't just pull comments with that flag, I pull anything that I find interesting. That being said, let's take a look at the first comment. This comment comes from Delectable Banana 6914. Perligo Ponders. Why is Clancy's hair suddenly brown again after washing on shore in the outside? It's an interesting question when considering this from the perspective of the lore. From a certain real-world technical aspect, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense that Clancy or Tyler's pink hair that he's had throughout the Scaled and Icy era and has presumably dyed is just going to wash off in the sea. I don't think that's how hair dye works. I don't know. Never dyed my hair, but that is my understanding, is that, that's the point. You dye your hair and it doesn't just come out when you go swimming. Otherwise, it wouldn't really last very long. Could the dye have washed off in the ocean? I mean, yes, but technically, I think that is what happened. Again, how did that happen when his hair was dyed? I don't know. Maybe I'm completely talking out of turn. I could be wrong about how hair dye works. But regardless, in this particular instance, you need to leave aside the realism of that moment and consider it more in light of almost a metaphor here, right? The oversaturation, the overly colorful Scaled and Icy era was representative of the bishop's control over him, and how they were forcing this burst of color into the lifeless city I can't remember exactly his words in the journal, but he did touch upon this. And he said something along the lines of, it was almost ironic, right? How gray and drab everything in Dema is. And then when they want to do this propaganda piece, they just flood everything with so much color. And so I think the fact that his hair was colored and the fact that we see it given that color in a little, like, almost TV spot, it's not a TV spot, I don't know, in a teaser for the Scaled and Icy live stream, I think it was. We see that Josh colors his hair, and it's this weird projection, the evil Josh colors his hair, and the Josh there is almost a representative of Dema's control and watchfulness over him, because he's not actually the torchbearer in that moment. He's this projection of the torchbearer that I believe Nico put into Clancy's mind. So all that is to say, I think the pink hair is representative of Dema's control over Clancy, and therefore, when he starts to escape and get farther away from Dema, that color fades and returns to his normal color as he's starting to return to the rebel Clancy, as opposed to the propaganded Clancy, the one who's being used as a tool for the bishops. So yes, in a practical sense, the ocean washed it away, but if you want to understand it beyond the sense of that maybe not really making sense in a realistic way, it faded and the ocean was able to wash it away because he was leaving Dema's control. So you could take from that it's metaphorical or it's literal, but I think ultimately that is why it happens from a visual perspective. Next, we have a comment from Pathetic Moonheart with a timestamp I think which is in relation to a previous episode of Perligo Ponders, but the particular context it's replying to I don't think is terribly relevant, which is why I didn't include it. But we see here, this person write, I think he's a reflection of Clancy's internal state. I saw a theory somewhere saying, it's topical, saying that the torchbearer only ever had red hair in Clancy's mind, and therefore the torchbearer only accepted the red in his perspective and mind. Cool to think about. And I think that is a different outfit. So we're, I think, here talking about the different outfit that Clancy wears in the Contract music video. Utilizing the stole kind of demonstrates he's further corrupted by the notion of being a bishop by Nico and not completely himself anymore, especially in his own brain. So again, this kind of plays off the idea, which I hold, and I'm willing, I'm not saying this is canonical, but I think it makes the most sense to see the torchbearer in the Contract music video, in the Outside music video, and in the Scaled and Icy era as not the real torchbearer, and specifically in the Outside and in the Contract as a projection of Clancy's mind. And that's why we see him with, as this person points out, with red hair in the Contract. I don't know that I fully buy this theory, though, because I'm pretty sure the torchbearer has red hair in the Overcompensate video as well, although I'd have to go back and look at that, to be fair, because it might only be when he's in Dema, and that wasn't the real torchbearer in Dema, probably. So, I don't know. I don't know necessarily what you mean by accepted the red, if that's becoming sort of a dark, almost corrupted by blurry face version. That could make sense. But yeah, I would be curious to take a deeper dive and go through and look at all the instances where the torchbearer has red hair and compare that to when he doesn't, and if that completely lines up with when he's a projection of Clancy's mind, or is a projection of the torchbearer at the very least, and isn't the real torchbearer. That would be my general answer. I'm inclined to accept this theory. I think it's compelling. I would have to look into it a little bit more to be fully on board with it, but I think it's a good direction to look. Well, next we have a Spotify comment from One Little Bandito. I feel as if the citizens of Dema know Tyler as the singer of the band 21 Pilots, maybe not as Clancy, for they see him as a different person. Also, I've been a fan for a while. Well, thank you for being a fan. Thank you for your comment. I do think this is an interesting way of considering Clancy's relationship to the citizens. I think Clancy in a lot of ways was the leader of the Banditos. The Torchbearer also was a leader, and perhaps the ultimate leader, and perhaps Clancy was just a captain that he had appointed to lead them into battle or what have you. But he's not the leader of the citizens of Dema, and he's not even necessarily the leader of the citizens who are rebel sympathizers within Dema. The letters that we got from the Clancy World Tour seem to indicate something of a disconnect between the two factions. Now, they are an alliance, but it does seem like those within the city have to be persuaded to leave and join the Banditos, and some of them might not want to, even if they are rebels or rebel sympathizers. I don't know, that's a whole other kind of side of this, but all that is to say, I think it's interesting to consider that those within the city, the non-Banditos, might be looking at who Clancy is, or who this character, Tyler or Clancy, is, because again, as we discussed in a previous episode, Tyler as his name is actually canonical as well. But this figure of Tyler is only someone that they really are aware of as the person who put on the show in the city, and this sort of celebrity, as it were, who's being propped up by the bishops. All the citizens of Dema know him as this, rebel sympathizers or not. Now, there is also indication in the I'm Clancy video that he was becoming famous in the city before they turned him into a propaganda piece. And in fact, that was part of what motivated the bishops to turn him into a propaganda piece, was because he was becoming famous. He was a bit of a celebrity, and they were worried he was going to influence them away from Dema and vialism. So they're like, okay, we're going to take this celebrity and make him a mouthpiece for our ideas and teachings. But even in that context, he could still be more widely known as Tyler, as opposed to the Clancy that we know as that rebel leader. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that answers your question or plays upon this idea. You didn't really have a question, more of a comment. But I think it's an interesting way, again, of looking at the citizens, and makes a good amount of sense. Next up, we have a comment from Haley Bailey. The letter describes the other figure making a path across trench. I think the drag path is also how other Clancys find the current one, if that makes any sense. Thanks for reading my comment. It really means a lot. This comment in particular is in response to, I believe, the latest episode of Perligo Ponders, number 28, in which we discussed Dragpath, and a comment from Haley Bailey about Dragpath, in which she said Dragpath had a connection to the events of the Jumpsuit music video, and I asked for further clarification on what she meant by that. So again, she writes, the letter describes the other figure making a path. I think that Dragpath is how the other Clancys find the current one. I think this makes a lot of sense. I think my interpretation of Dragpath aligns with this. Even what we clearly see in the song Dragpath, right? I left a dragpath on the surface as evidence for you to find. It's basically the core of a lot of what he's saying there. That also ties into the idea of the Clancy at the end of the story, the one that we see lose in city walls, does so that he can set up the ability for the next Clancy to escape. And almost that drag path, that final drag path in the tower facing Nico, was undergone so that things could be set up and established for the next Clancy to be the final Clancy and to be the one who makes it out and doesn't succumb to the power of temptation, of control, and become another blurry face, another Nico. A bit of a shorter comment because this is more of a clarification and a follow-up. Thank you for the follow-up and the clarification. Again, it's an interesting idea. I don't have a lot to say other than I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. Next, we have a comment from Octopus Pancake 6949. I have a question. Is the blue from the American Music Awards performance important? Blurry told us never to wear blue as it means defeat. Could I just be reading into things for Perligo Ponders? Yes, that's an interesting idea. I'm always a little skeptical of the idea of blue meaning defeat. Not because I don't think it doesn't. Not because I think it doesn't. Because obviously we did get that tweet from Blurryface, the Blurryface Twitter account. But then the question is that more directly related to that moment in the story, or is that an overarching thing, and every time we see blue, it means defeat? We certainly saw a lot of blue during the Scaled and Icy era, but we also see a good amount of blue in later eras as well. And perhaps that was just cluing us in to the idea that he was going to be defeated at the end. That's a fair argument. If we do want to run with the idea that blue always necessarily means defeat, or indicates that Clancy's been defeated, or whatever, is a symbol for defeat, understanding the AMA's performance in light of that could go something like this. Clancy lost in city walls to Blurryface. He has been defeated. And now this performance is taking place in an era of defeat. The Breach era is one of defeat in a lot of ways. And Drag Path, again, is a drag path of defeat. I mean, all drag paths are him being defeated by Nico and brought back into Dema. And then the final time we see him defeated by Nico is in City Walls. Again, he isn't dragged anywhere because he's already in Dema, but I think you could almost consider that to be a type of drag path. Drag path becoming a more overarching term than just the literal dragged path. So then they incorporate the color blue into the MA's performance because it represents this moment that we're in and what the drag path is. The drag path is the moment of defeat. Now, the song as a whole ends on a hopeful note, and I think has a victory within it. But if we're talking about drag path specifically, again, the drag path is a symbol of defeat. So it could make sense to incorporate blue into that, especially when performed live. But why do you think the blue is important at the AMA's performance? Next, we have a comment from Lubus Z. I think they're going to continue constructing different storylines, but more loose ones, like we see in Self-Titled or 3 Cheers by My Chemical Romance. I'm not really familiar with that album, but I'll take your word. Is this Self-Titled by My Chemical Romance or by 21pilots? I'll assume it's by 21pilots, because I don't know if MCR has a self-titled album. They'll obviously also be a lot less complex than the whole Trench saga, but I think their next complex albums will still tie into the character of Blurryface in one way, or next concept albums will still tie into the character of Blurryface in one way or another. I think they'll try to make the stories a lot shorter, especially since we know the Dema storyline was originally only supposed to be 3 albums long. So I think we can expect more stories that play out over the course of just 1 to 2 albums and eras. This would be interesting and cool to see. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Again, like I've said, I wouldn't be surprised if they come back and do more story building and world building. I think it's something that they really enjoy doing. I kind of also wouldn't be shocked if we see creative narrative building, but in a way that is very different to what we've seen with the Trench saga. And I don't just mean in terms of subject matter or setting in sort of this dystopian fantasy world, but it might not even be a story in the same way. And the reason why I say that is because Tyler, especially during the Breach era and some of the interviews we were looking at that they did while promoting the Ohio show, he mentioned that while they don't want to reinvent themselves to the point of losing who they are, they also want to move past what they've been doing and not just keep doing the same thing over and over again. That wasn't the first time he said this. It hasn't been the only time he said that. It's a pretty common theme that we've seen them mention, both Tyler and Josh, since Clancy and Blurryface, that they want to wrap up the story, they want to do it well, but there's a sentiment I get from them that they're ready to move on to something new. And so it might be something that's completely different to how we've seen it. I do agree that they will probably continue to do something more than just the music, because that seems like something they really enjoy doing. I'm very curious to see what it'll be, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be like another story in a sort of series of books or anything like that. I'm not saying it won't be with any sort of confidence, but I wouldn't be surprised if what they do next takes us by surprise and is unexpected for all of us. Then the final comment of this episode of Perligo Ponders is from Nix9-7756. For Perligo Ponders, I wonder if Trench was even truly real within the story, or if maybe Banditos are more like ghosts who didn't give in to vialism. This would explain how the city walls have no entrance or exit, and why Torchbearer couldn't truly do anything, and why he got there too late to stop Clancy from becoming a bishop. This also now reminds me of Morph, and whether it might relate to both Clancy and Torchbearer, or is just a foreshadowing. I know this idea is a bit half-baked, but I hope it's understandable. Yeah, it does feel a little half-formulated, and I don't mean that as a bad thing, but more that I would love to hear more of your thoughts on this idea, because I think it's interesting. I don't know that there's a lot of, I think it's an interesting thought experiment to imagine Trench as a non-real place within the lore, and that the city of Dema is the only real place that exists, and the Banditos are just dead people who are coming back and haunting Clancy. Again, I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on this, because I don't know that we see a lot of evidence for it. Is it a cool idea? Yeah. But I just don't see anything that supports that this is actually what's going on in the story. You know, we do see ghosts. Well, ghosts are like zombie-like things, the bodies of the Glorious Gone seized as vessels. And we do, have these projections of the Torchbearer who are almost ghost-like without being necessarily dead people. And so I kind of get where you're coming from. But again, I would like to see more evidence or indications that the trench outside the walls is all kind of a dream. But I am also curious to think about that more, because it could almost be an alternate story, right? Not necessarily something that's supposed to be a theory about what really happens in the story, but a sort of fanfic adjacent kind of thing where, what if trench wasn't real? And we look at the story through that lens with a different spin on it. And so that's why Clancy says, you know, why won't they tell me why no one ever comes back from beyond? Or yeah, how can you not make it outside the walls? No one ever goes out there. No one ever comes back. Well, because they're all dead. That's why the vultures are flying around the walls, because they're death eaters. They feed on the bodies outside the walls, or something like that. I don't know. So yeah, it could be an interesting way to think about the story, and an interesting sort of alternate parallel universe to the dema that I think and the trench that were really shown. Thanks for your comment. And again, if you want to flesh this out a bit more for a longer, more built out theory or alternate story, I would love to see that and look through it and read through it. And with that being said, that brings us to the end of this episode of Perligo Ponders. Thank you to all of you who commented. As always, if you'd like your own comment to be featured in the next episode, just leave a comment about something that you find interesting. And as always, don't forget to subscribe,